True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Kathy Stobaugh married the wrong man. And once she realized her mistake, she did everything right in order to set off on a better course. She worked full-time, went back to college, and accomplished her dream of being a kindergarten teacher. Saving her money, she rented a new house, and she moved there with her 2 children. But her husband, Charles, was just not going to let her get away so easily. On December 29, 2004, Kathy happily hummed a tune as she gathered her divorce settlement papers together and drove off in her car. Charles had finally agreed to talk things over and reach a financial settlement with her. She had this newfound hope that their post-divorce lives could be civil, even though she held no false hopes that they would ever be friends. Join us at the quiet end for Gone and Never Forgotten, the Kathy Stobaugh Story. Did Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband kill her and hide her body, or are we meant to believe that she just walked off one day, left her kids behind, a day before her divorce hearing? That's a big ask.
It sure seems to be.
So what have we got for a beer? This is a Texas case.
We have an iconic Texas beer, Shinerbach. So everybody that drinks beer knows about Shinerbach. And it's not a particularly good beer, but it's been around forever.
I'd say it's very serviceable.
Well, it is. I mean, it's not terrible.
No.
It's just not great. It's what you'd consider a traditional Bach beer, just a dark amber color. There's a sweet malt aroma and a nice caramel taste, and it drinks pretty easily. So, good enough beer, serviceable beer, right?
Absolutely.
And this beer is brewed in Shiner, Texas, and it's been brewed since 1909.
Wow,
So
pretty good.
That's a long time ago.
Yep.
And yeah, it's a good beer.
It sounds great. Now, we have this local brewery, Little Toad's Creek. Is that what it's called?
Little Toad Creek.
Little Toad Creek. And they do great beer, but they also have been doing these mixed drinks in a can. These mules. There's a watermelon jalapeno. There's a gin and grapefruit. So I'm thinking one day maybe you'll let me do a review of one of those for the non-beer drinkers.
Well, sure.
Okay.
I mean, you could do that. You could review a wine if you want.
I'm not a huge wine person.
Or marijuana. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'm just saying maybe one day when you do a beer, I'll do that. Just to give our non-beer drinkers something to think about.
Okay.
All right.
Well, there's one woman who wanted us to do vodka reviews.
Yeah. And ciders have been brought up a lot as well.
Yep.
So I'm open to that kind of stuff because what I was thinking when I went to Little Toad is you can be a brewery and you can do things besides just beer. You can distill liquors and you can do other things.
You can. I mean, and Little Toad does just that. They brew their beer and distill their own liquors.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound like a commercial for them. I've promised they're not paying us. It just gave me that idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's open up the Shinerbach.
Okay, we'll hang out here at the quiet end. I was noticing, and I'm sure you did too, now that things are opening up again, Gold Chain Guy's back. You see him sitting over there?
I do, and I think over the pandemic, he's kind of cleaned himself up and done some manscaping.
He has, and I'm pretty sure that it is a new toupee that he's got.
Yeah, pretty realistic.
Yeah, he's looking good.
Maybe he got extensions or something. We're going to have a chat with him later, and we'll let people know what we find out.
Yeah, see what's going on.
But I think there's a couple women over there he might actually have a chance with.
Well, don't give him too much credit just yet.
All right.
Let's see if he goes after them or if he approaches them and how things end up.
All right, but he's looking better to me is all I have to say about that.
Well, you're the judge of that.
Okay, so let's start this story down here at the quiet end.
Okay. Kathy Stobaugh was born Catherine Lynn Mundy in Gatesville, Texas. This is in 1961. Her father, James Mundy, met her mother Jean at a church revival in Gatesville. Now, after they got married, James opened his own laundry business, and he also drove a truck to get some extra money. Kathy had a big brother named Mark, who was 2 years older than her, and they were very close. And then 5 years after Kathy came Chris, the youngest, and that's the family. Mom, Dad, and 3 kids.
And Kathy was their only daughter.
Only daughter.
And Kathy was a pretty girl. She was popular with both boys and girls in her school. She was in the 4-H club because they were country people, and she really enjoyed riding horses. Both of her brothers were very protective of her, especially once she started dating. Not that she dated a lot, but they would remember guys coming around to hang out with them just so they could get a good look at Kathy or get in with her. So her brothers kept an eye on these guys, because Kathy didn't always pick the best guys. Something a lot of us girls have to learn over the years.
So this was like in high school.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm. She
just liked the delinquent types, the bad boys?
A little bit. I mean, it's the country, so I don't know if they were super bad. But
Okay.
they had a little bit of an edge to them, and that attracted her. Actually, her first serious boyfriend was so problematic that Mark got into a fist fight with him more than one time.
Jeez. Now that's a protective big brother.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yes, for sure. Mark and Chris really worried that she was going to end up marrying that guy. But then she broke up with him when she moved out to Denton to take classes at Texas Women's University.
Do we know why they got into fistfights?
We don't know the specifics, no, but he did things with the sister they didn't approve of. So,
like good brothers, they took care of things.
yeah, and I don't think it got to the point of physical violence against her, but just not being as respectful as they wanted him to be.
Sure.
Getting into arguments. And looking back, though, they might think this guy would have been a better choice than what Kathy ended up with, unfortunately.
I'm sure they would.
Yes.
Kathy wanted to be a physical therapist, and TWU had a very good physical therapy program. Denton, it was just about 150 miles from her family's home, which meant that Kathy was able to be home on weekends. Denton's a 2-college town, TWU on the east side, and the University of North Texas, known as UNT, on the west side of town. Denton was much larger than the town where Kathy grew up. Well, it sounds like most every place is much larger than where she grew up.
Yeah, you're right.
She really enjoyed going into the city to spend time with her friends. This was a pretty new, exciting environment for this old country girl.
Yeah, and while Kathy was in Denton, that's when she met Charles Stobaugh. Charles was handsome. He was 24 years old with thick dark hair and sideburns that were popular at the time. He still lived at home on his family's dairy farm with his parents and his brothers. That was a big part of his life. So he and his brothers didn't go to college. That wasn't even something they thought about. But they did like to make money, and Charles had a decent job. He worked at a local factory that made plastic food containers, and he continued to work the farm as well. But of course it was farming that he loved the most, and he aspired to own his own land one day. And he told Kathy as they were dating all about his dream, and Kathy said, well, you know what? That doesn't sound too bad.
No, I can deal with this, right?
Yes.
Sounds like a good life. Of course, they're not married or anything yet, right?
Well, that's where they're headed, and she kind of gives up on her dream for a while.
Yeah, well, she was unhappy with her physical therapy courses, and the main problem with that was that she wasn't very good at science. And guess what? That's a big part of the curriculum.
Yes.
So Kathy started to wish she had chosen to get a teaching degree. She did love children, and she wanted to teach kindergarten. So maybe switching majors or something. And Kathy's also getting anxious because she wants a child of her own. Now, they're not married or anything yet, right? But
No.
She's already thinking about, well, I want to have kids. All
Well,
right.
she's a country girl, and she wanted to have a family.
Now, Charles wasn't happy about her college courses at all. He didn't go to college.
No, and he just kind of dragged her down, I have to say.
Charles wanted Kathy to quit school, get a job, maybe a secretary or a receptionist or something like that. But at the same time, he told Kathy she was much too smart for college. She could be successful without a degree, he told her.
Well, I think he just didn't want her to go to college and meet different types of people and maybe leave him behind.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
Well, it's reasonable, but I don't think it's right. If you really love someone, you should want them to be whatever they want to be and reach their goals. So he was a little bit dragging her down, and this line of dialogue landed on her at just the right time as she was having these doubts about her science classes. So instead of changing majors to get a degree and become a teacher, she started to consider quitting school altogether and just marrying and having a family of her own.
Yeah, but what she didn't realize, at least early on, was that Charles was, as we would maybe say nicely, frugal to a fault. So he's a real cheapskate, wasn't he?
Terrible.
He was obsessed with making money, and even more obsessed with saving it. He wasn't romantic, really not at all, but he sure did love to talk about finding the cheapest prices on anything that he needed. Like a lot of cheap people, when he did spend money, it was always, or almost always, spent on himself. Kathy hadn't known Charles long enough to realize that he was such a skinflint. She had grown up in a family where finances were tight, and her parents always taught her that saving money was a virtue. So she's coming out of that kind of thought, and she thought, well, it's a good thing. Charles would be a good provider. But he was such a miser. She just grew to despise his actions like that after being married to him for a few years.
Oh yeah, it became a big, big problem. But of course, at this point, she didn't know that. He was handsome and she was going to have a house and kids, so she quit college and agreed to marry him. This was a mistake that led to a good 20 years of misery. After their wedding, Kathy took several short-lived jobs as a clerk, and she and Charles rented a house on a piece of farmland between Gainesville and Decatur. Then Kathy was hired as an administrative assistant at North Central Texas College. Charles was working full-time at a manufacturing plant. Also, though, he continued to do work on his family's dairy farm. He was a hard worker. He worked a lot. And early on, Kathy was impressed that he had this strong work ethic and he would be a good provider.
Yeah, but nobody shared in that good providerhood.
No. But a few years later, Charles purchased a 100-acre farm, and it had a little brick house on it. He only put his name on the deed. So the house was small, like I said, and it was quite outdated. There were 3 bedrooms, but they were tiny, and the kitchen was really old-fashioned with like some 1960s wallpaper. This house sat near the middle of the property up on a hill, which did allow for a nice view of the land, so Kathy saw potential. The farm also had multiple outbuildings, barns, and a gate down at the end of a long driveway. Charles raised cows with the help of his brothers, planting hay on his land and also keeping his livestock on the Stobaugh family property, his parents' farm.
Yeah, now Kathy wasn't picky about the house, but she really did hate the kitchen. There really wasn't any storage space, and like you said, it was in serious need of a remodel. Charles told her that they would remodel the house, but it never happened. Charles was good at making promises about what they were going to do and never coming through with it.
Yeah, and I think that was more early on, and then as the years went by, he just stopped giving a shit completely and said, tough, deal with it.
Yeah, he did.
And that's when the marriage really fell apart.
And instead of doing what Kathy wanted in terms of the remodel, he ended up buying expensive farm equipment. Now, neither he nor Kathy understood about marital property, so Charles was believing that he was the sole owner of all of their property if it was kept all in his name. How wrong that is he'll find that out and if they get to a divorce.
He will, yeah.
And there was nothing in Kathy's name, and she was completely reliant on him, at least from a financial aspect.
Yeah, and I think that's a big reason why Kathy didn't try for a divorce earlier in her marriage, because she thought she had nothing. She thought that if she broke up with him, he would keep everything, and how would she raise her kids?
Well, yeah, that's probably true, but why don't you go to an attorney?
Because she didn't even think about that was a possibility that he would have to share.
No, I mean, go to an attorney and say, I want to divorce my husband, but I don't want to have no money.
Yes, but Kathy didn't know that she did share in any of it. She was assuming she had nothing. So you have to put yourself in that place.
All right.
So Charles seemed to have no problem spending money when it benefited him, and he bought himself a new pickup truck and also a fancy Lincoln. Kathy kept her old beater from her college years, And even if Charles wasn't using his Lincoln, he forbid Kathy from using it. Now, that wouldn't fly in our house, and I don't think it would fly in most houses.
I sure wouldn't. Wouldn't even let her drive his car, please.
Isn't that horrible?
Stupid.
It is stupid.
So it turned out, really, that Charles was just this cold guy who didn't know how to show love. Kathy felt more like his possession than his partner or his wife. He wasn't one to buy jewelry, or any gift, really. Any money that Kathy earned went into a joint account. That was controlled by Charles. He gave Kathy an allowance for household necessities, as if her money just belonged to him. They did start having arguments about the money, but Charles didn't make any changes.
No, and Kathy soon realized that marrying Charles had been a mistake, but decided to make the best of things. Then, when she became pregnant with their daughter Cherie in 1988, Charles complained. He said he didn't want a child, and he spent most of her pregnancy complaining about what it was doing to her body, about weight gain. Then after Cherie was born, Kathy was happy, because like Kathy, baby Cherie had this blonde hair and this big wide smile. She was just a joy. But Charles didn't seem to bond with his new daughter at all, and he still continued to complain about Kathy's body and even called her insulting names.
Like fatty?
Yeah, maybe worse. Just not a nice guy.
He doesn't sound like a real good guy. Other than having a good work ethic, he doesn't seem to have much else going for him.
Exactly. Well, after Kathy's little brother Chris graduated from high school, he had found a job near Kathy and Charles's farm. And as he saved to get his own place, he did live with them for a couple of months. Chris had always liked Charles. He believed that he was financially successful, and he thought he was generous.
You'll find out.
Yeah, but Charles always seemed so well-dressed and drove these nice vehicles that Chris was impressed. But then after staying with them, Chris was surprised to learn that Kathy was kept on this strict budget by Charles. All she got to spend was this small weekly check Charles made out for the local grocery store. So how demeaning is that? Kathy had to get everything the family needed with that small check, and if she did need cash, she had to keep the grocery expenses below the amount of the check so the cashier would give her some cash back.
That's not a workable solution.
It's terrible, and it's not like they were hurting for money. They actually became pretty well off financially, although you wouldn't know it by looking at them because he was so cheap.
It also wasn't long before Kathy confided to Chris that she thought Charles was having an affair. He was cheating on her with other women. He seemed able to come home sometimes with makeup on his shirt. Well, that might be a clue, you think?
I think so.
The lipstick on the collar trick. So one time when she suspected that Charles was seeing an old girlfriend, Kathy drove to the other woman's apartment, and as she's knocking on the door, Charles is climbing out of the second floor window. Gotcha. But she didn't. Charles was a decent enough looking guy, and he could come across as well off and charming. Well, sure. He got himself Kathy, right?
Yeah, and now he could afford nice clothes and drive expensive vehicles, and it made it easy for him to pick up women, even though he was married.
Well, that shouldn't be an impediment, should it?
Well, it certainly is. And Chris was really angry. He wanted to confront his brother-in-law because, remember, Chris and Mark were very protective of Kathy. But Kathy was worried, and she convinced him, "Don't make any waves, I'll deal with it."
Now, Chris did eventually find a roommate, and he moved into his own place not too long after he and Kathy had this discussion. He wasn't happy with the way Charles was speaking to his sister, but he followed her wishes not to say anything. And he moved out of the house hoping that things would improve for Kathy, because she was the nicest person he'd ever known, a really kind lady.
Very big-hearted and generous, very different from Charles.
Yeah, but nevertheless, Chris told Kathy that he would take care of Charles if he ever hurt her. All she had to do was say the word, and he'd be there. So that's a good thing. This is the little brother, not even the big brother.
Right, right.
Now, of course, after saying that, Chris got busy settling into his own life as an adult. He became a cop, got married, and had his own children. So it ended up that he didn't see Kathy very often. But he hoped that she was happy.
Of course, and I think he just assumed that everything was going okay.
Yeah, right? No news is good news.
But that's until 1990, when Kathy actually showed up at Chris's front door. She had a black eye and several bruises. She and her daughter Cherie stayed with Chris and his family for a couple of days, and Chris's wife helped her get some of her things from the farm, so she was done, at least she thought she was. She planned to divorce Charles and just start her life over. Her older brother Mark owned a rental house, which he helped Kathy and Cherie move into. She found a new job and she filed for a divorce from Charles. And her entire family was just happy to see her leaving this unhappy marriage. Chris drove out to Gainesville and warned Charles to never hurt his sister again. He said, "If you ever hurt my sister, I will kill you."
Well, that's plain enough.
Yeah, but he never did kill Charles.
No.
When Charles showed up at Kathy's new house, he begged her to come home, because of course now he's going to promise anything under the sun.
Well, this is a familiar story.
It sure is. He promised never to cheat on her, never to hit her again. He even promised to build her a new modern house or fix up the one they had. He had heard her complain about the house for years, so he knew that would be something that would appeal to her. He even told her that they could have a second child. But Kathy held her ground. She was afraid of Charles, and she called up her brother Mark to come over until Charles would leave. Then Kathy's father came to her place as well, and finally Charles was convinced that he needed to leave, or there was going to be trouble.
It sounds like. But Charles was persistent, wasn't he?
Yes.
He wanted to get back with Kathy, and he made more and more promises to lure her back. And he was acting like the charming guy from years ago who had won her over when they started their relationship. So the end result is eventually he wore her down, and she agreed to return to him. So she left this new life she was starting to build on her own, and went back to the farm with Charles. She probably had her doubts, right?
Oh, I'm sure, yes.
But she hoped that she had done the right thing. She wanted her daughter, Cherie, to have an intact family with a father who showed her how men should treat women. Well, it's probably not Charles. Things seemed better for a few months. Better, at least better enough that Kathy got pregnant with her second child.
Yeah, so Kathy gave birth to a son, and they named him Tommy. But then Charles went back to calling her names and complaining about her weight. Things just went back to the way they were. He was actually colder and more closed off than ever, and it seemed apparent that he was thinking of no one but himself. By this point, Kathy had really fallen out of love with him, and there was little chance that he was ever going to change, and she realized that. But she loved her children, and she did everything she could for them, even though she wasn't happy in her life. The house was not sold or remodeled. Charles was cheaper than ever, and he expected Kathy to feed their family on this really inadequate amount of money that he would give her, which he took from both of their incomes. So she was working as well.
She's working and making money, and they're pooling their money together, but she has no control over her money.
No, it's pretty much an allowance, and I'm sure she was doing all the child care and housework and everything at home as well.
You know that.
She planted a garden in order to save money on groceries, and that helped a little. At least she got some produce. And then she kept bees in the yard for honey. So she was pretty inventive at thinking up ways to make things better, even in this horrible situation.
Yeah, I know, it's second guessing, but she's already left him once after he beat her. And she gets back into this relationship that's not any different from what it used to be. That's when you walk out right away.
Sure, but that's not her fault. That's his fault.
Yeah?
Yeah.
When Tommy was an infant, Charles ignored him, much as he had ignored Cherie. Except once he was old enough to help around the farm, then Charles decided who he was worth spending time with. Charles taught him how to farm, how to repair farm equipment. Now, as he's kind of bonding with his son, who's old enough to work on the farm, he continued to ignore his daughter, Cherie, even getting more verbally abusive towards her.
Well, yeah, he seemed to believe that women were just inferior to men. And as Cherie entered adolescence, Kathy began to notice that Charles pulled away from his daughter even more. And of course, by now she's regretting giving him another chance, because she just can't imagine going on like this forever. So she began to make a plan to escape this life and the man that was making her feel depressed and hopeless and start over with her and her kids. So she started out slowly. She had asked Charles to remove some shelves in this cramped, dark kitchen they had, and he had repeatedly refused, so she decided to do it herself. Of course, it wasn't done perfectly, but she was satisfied to at least have the space she wanted, and it empowered her. She was taking things on her own. But, of course, when Charles saw what she had done, he was predictably angry. She was not supposed to do anything without his permission, so he screamed at her, and then he gave her the silent treatment for 2 weeks. But if he believed he was punishing Kathy with this silence, he really couldn't have been more wrong. She was actually really happy to have some peace and quiet for a change and not have to deal with him.
You won't talk to me? That's fine.
It's not a healthy thing, but it did give her a little bit of a break, I guess.
And now she had a job as an administrative assistant at the North Central Texas College, which she really enjoyed. She had made many friends there, and they all realized that Kathy was in an unhappy marriage. She told some of her co-workers that she was close to about her desire to go back to school and get a teaching degree. She'd been watching other college students making their dreams come true, and she decided that she wanted that for herself. And that would give her a better life, and it would give her kids a better life.
And also set a better example for her daughter.
Absolutely.
So Kathy made her decision, and then she began to work really hard. She had this life where she worked full-time, and she went to night school full-time. This was hard work, as she was still expected to care for the home and cook for Charles. But, she really loved it, and she actually got all A's in her classes.
That's pretty impressive. She's going to school, and that's full-time school.
Yes.
I mean, it's not like take 8 years to get your degree. This is full-time. She's working full-time. She's maintaining the household.
She was working her ass off, but you know what? She was so motivated.
She must have been.
Once you're motivated like that, it's amazing what you can do. And she was a smart woman to be able to do that.
Well, I guess she must have been.
Yes. She shared with a co-worker that we're just going to call Linda that she was planning a divorce from Charles. Once she got her degree and found a teaching job, she planned to rent a house for her and her kids, and she kept this a secret so that Charles couldn't interfere. She had dreams for a better life for her children, and she was very determined to get them out of this toxic home environment they were living in. In the spring of 2003, Kathy had only 20 credit hours left to complete her degree, and she was really anxious to finish, as you can imagine. She can see the light at the end of the tunnel. So she registered to complete the final courses in just 1 semester, and at the same time, she trained her replacement for her administrative assistant position.
That's a pretty busy semester. 20 hours?
Yes.
Jeez.
I think home was so miserable that she was willing to do just about anything.
Oh, it sounds like it. Jill, what are you burning out here? Bodies?
Well, no. I'm throwing in all of our earbuds and headphones with a little bit of lighter fluid as my protest against podcast ads in my favorite shows. I'm just getting into a story or I'm dozing off and it's interrupted with commercials. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Nice movie reference. Anyway, let's just simmer down here. You do know that our True Crime Brewery listeners have the option to subscribe to our premium show for ad-free episodes and bonus episodes, right? It costs as little as $4 per month, and these contributions help support the cost of producing TCB.
Well, of course. I love and appreciate our subscribers. I worked for weeks with our IT girl to set that up, and all because I have a deeply held belief that our listeners shouldn't have to hear ads.
That's well said. Now, let me ask you this. How are we going to record this week's episode without our headphones?
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Well, you stay here. I'll go get the hose.
Okay, hurry. So once her replacement was ready to go, Kathy quit that job. And of course, Charles was super furious about that. He said they needed her salary and she shouldn't have done that without consulting him.
Well, of course not.
But she's right on the verge of graduating college, and he had no appreciation or praise for that at all. Like, oh, you're going to graduate in 6 months. That's wonderful. Nothing. No support.
No.
But it didn't really bother her as much at this point because she was becoming really more confident and independent. So she said to Charles, you know what? You're going to have to deal with it. And that went over like nothing good.
Nothing good.
No.
Yeah, actually, when the college staff threw a going-away party for Kathy, Charles did attend. I would be surprised because it didn't sound like he would want to do that, but he did. However, he sulked the whole time. He stood at the wall, facing the wall, and didn't talk to anyone the entire time. So let's celebrate Kathy. Well, I'll just go stand in the corner here and look at the wall.
Yeah, I mean, I guess she ignored him, but she must have felt hurt or at least embarrassed around her friends.
I would think.
To have this dick there that's her husband.
Yeah, well, wait a minute. I think you're giving dicks a bad name here.
All right, to have this douche there who was her husband.
That's better.
Okay. But you know what? She was determined to enjoy this time with her friends, and she wasn't going to let him spoil this for her. Even though, why the hell did he even go there if he was going to be such an ass?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it just seems to me that it's out of his character that he would have gone.
I think it must have been some kind of controlling maneuver, just so she couldn't have too much fun. So while Kathy wasn't earning a salary, Charles continued to complain. They had less money in the bank, plus she wasn't around to cook and clean for him. She had become really self-assured and cool toward him. His cruel words were having less of an effect, and I'm sure that bothered him. Kathy was studying more than ever to complete her degree, and he didn't like this new sense of autonomy she had. He really missed his compliant, emotionally beaten-down spouse. And then, when Kathy's car finally kicked the bucket, he did reluctantly buy her a new car, a Lincoln like his, because she stood up for herself.
That's right. And Kathy had been busy making plans for life without Charles. But one of the things that was a hindrance was that she was still under the false belief that Charles owned the house and property without her. And since all of the vehicles and farm equipment were in his name alone, she believed that she would be starting from scratch if she left Charles. So she thought that leaving Charles meant giving up this property. But if that was the price it was going to cost her for her freedom, okay. She was just happy enough to be making a fresh start.
Sure, I mean, she really couldn't wait to start over. She told her family members that Charles had been so mentally and physically abusive to her that she couldn't even stand to be near him. She couldn't stand his touch on her skin. He worked a lot at night, so she was able to sleep alone in their bed most of the time. But if he was home at night, she would go sleep on the couch in the living room. She no longer was putting up with his abusive comments, and she stood up for herself. But it really broke her heart that her children were growing old enough to feel that tension and disharmony between their parents. And one of her biggest fears as a mom was that his verbal abuse of Cherie, her daughter, would damage her daughter's self-esteem, and that was a serious concern.
Well, it should be. Now, as her confidence grew, Kathy began asserting herself more. By doing that, though, her relationship with Charles only got worse. Now, he didn't want Kathy to leave him, but at the same time, he showed very little care or concern for her. So here's an example. One time when she was tending the beehives, remember they were making honey?
Sure.
She got attacked by the bees. They swarmed her and she was stung multiple times. So Sherry goes running to her father to get some help for her mom. Charles just dismissed her. He told Cherie that the bees were Kathy's responsibility. And Jesus, and she could deal with them on her own. Certainly Kathy had no hopes that her husband would help her either. She was used to living with a man who showed her no empathy or affection. Just a prince.
Well, another way that Kathy prepared for her divorce and her new life was to keep a journal of her life with Charles. She began writing in the journal on June 1st, 2002, and then she stopped one day before she moved out of the home she'd shared with Charles. That was on May 31st, 2004. After one particularly vicious fight, Kathy left the house for a couple of days, but she did call and check in on her kids several times. Cherie turned 16 in January 2004, and Kathy made plans to have dinner at one of her favorite restaurants. Charles was invited, but he was working on his mom's farm. So Cherie spoke to her grandmother, Charles's mother, Helen Stobaugh, and asked her to tell her father to meet them at the restaurant. So Charles, he showed up 2 hours late for the dinner, and then he wasn't pleasant at all. And this is one of my pet peeves, is someone who's rude to a waiter or doesn't tip. And that's what he did. He complained about the prices, and he refused to leave a tip for the waiter. So Kathy went back in and left a tip because she was embarrassed.
I mean, like it's the waiter's fault, right?
Yeah. Fault for what? What is he even complaining about?
The waiter conspired to charge too much for the food.
Right.
Yeah, stupid stuff.
So that February, Kathy turned 43, so she had her birthday, and her children bought her a present and a birthday cake. Then just the three of them went out to dinner while Charles stayed home and didn't even mention his wife's birthday at all. So this is a marriage really on the skids, maybe deeper down in the skids.
It's almost to rock bottom.
Yeah.
So there would be entire days when Kathy and Charles didn't speak to each other. And he could go days without talking to Cherie either. Tommy, though, was still by his side quite a bit, and Charles would talk to him. But none of that female talk stuff.
No, so he was definitely a misogynist.
Among other things.
Among other things, I'm sure. I'm sure there was a lot more. So that April 8th, Kathy wrote about an accident Cherie had the night before when she was driving home from the movies with her friends. So it was a one-car accident, just her car, and nobody was seriously injured. But Charles didn't ask about that. Is everybody okay? He was just angry about the car being damaged. So he told Cherie that she would not be allowed to use any of the family's vehicles. That would be her punishment for getting in the accident. Even though there's no indication that she was doing anything wrong, she wasn't drinking or speeding or anything like that we know of. He also said that Cherie would have to pay to get the car out of the impound, which wasn't cheap. So because Cherie really hadn't been doing anything wrong, Kathy did defend her. She said, you know what, accidents happen. And this ended up causing an argument between Kathy and Charles.
I'm sure it did.
Kathy secretly taped this argument. She wanted the divorce judge to hear how he spoke to her when he was upset with her. And quite predictably, he had a temper tantrum, yelling at her, calling her names, even throwing things.
The next day after this little dust-up, Tommy called Kathy at her home, and he called from the Stobaugh dairy farm. Tommy left a message for Kathy to bring some aspirin to the farm for Charles. Immediately, right now. Kathy and Cherie were out running errands, and when they did get home, there were 2 messages on the machine from Charles, and they were demanding that she stop whatever she was doing and bring the aspirin to him. What Kathy was taken out of this was that Tommy was beginning to speak to her and Cherie the same way that Charles was speaking to them. Well, sure. He was learning this from his dad, right?
Exactly. He's treating women like second-class citizens. So that made Kathy probably speed up her exit.
Probably.
She had begun sleeping on an air mattress in the living room because she was tired of sleeping on the couch, and of course she refused to get in the bed with Charles. April 20th, Kathy taped another of their arguments, and in the tape she tells Charles that either she was moving out or he was. And he answered that he was not moving out, and neither would she. He'd been yelling at her about spending money, but the bank statement showed that it was actually Charles who had spent most of the money. Pretty much everything except what she had used for groceries and bills.
Well, that's a total surprise, isn't it?
No, not at all.
I know. So in May of 2004, Kathy graduated from college, and she had applied for jobs at nearby grammar schools using the college computer lab. There was a computer at home, but it was old. Again, Charles is cheap, and the internet at home was so slow that it wasn't even worth trying to use it. So Kathy kept explaining to Charles that she wouldn't have to drive to the computer lab so much if they had a new computer. But like a lot of things she said to him, he wasn't interested in hearing it. And actually, Kathy had asked to buy a computer ever since she had started taking college courses. But Charles always refused. It's not necessary. It wasn't necessary until Charles started to do some e-trading. And then he went right out and bought a top-of-the-line computer. Just again, an example of, if it's something for me, money is no expense.
Well, exactly. There's no limit for him.
Nope, just her.
So it was May 10th when Kathy wrote in her journal about renting a house in the town of Sanger for her and her children. So she only wanted a few items from the farmhouse, like her sewing machine and some things her grandmother had left her. She had new appliances delivered to the rental house, and she and Cherie shopped for new furniture and really had a lot of fun. That's the thing, is Kathy and Cherie did have a really good relationship, which makes what happens later even more upsetting. But anyway, when they left the farm, they only took their clothing with them. They didn't take anything really because Kathy didn't want to upset Charles at all. Plus, everything was old and shitty there. He never bought new furniture or invested in anything. And she wanted a nice, clean little house where she could pick things out and have it the way she wanted, and her kids could feel happy. So Kathy and the kids moved out on June 1st, 2004. Although she was very determined, she was terrified of what Charles might do. She told Cherie to be ready to put Tommy in the car and drive to the new house. Although Charles had forbidden Cherie from driving any of their vehicles after that car accident, Kathy had insisted that she have a car to drive, and she'd won that battle. So they lived out in this isolated area, and it would have been impossible for Cherie to get around otherwise. How could she even go out to work or see her friends or anything? And plus, Kathy depended on Cherie to help out taking Tommy to his activities. Nothing was within walking distance.
No, they're out there in the Wild West, I guess.
Yeah, in farm country.
Cherie and Kathy were very close. In some ways, they were more friends than mother-daughter. Kathy confided in Cherie because Cherie was the only other person who knew what life with Charles was like. And Cherie had a good understanding of why her mother was leaving. She was getting plenty of mental and emotional abuse from her father as well, so she's walking in the same shoes. Kathy wanted a life for her children without constant tension and fighting. She wanted to choose how she spent the money she worked for, and she wanted to start fresh. She didn't want Cherie to learn that the way Charles treated them was the way all men treated women. And she didn't want Tommy to grow up like his father either, because he was starting to go down that path. She knew that Tommy loved his father, and she would allow him to spend as much time together as they wanted, but she wanted Tommy to grow up in a more peaceful environment and not end up like Charles.
Yeah, that's just a really sad part of this story. So Charles was served with the divorce papers on May 28th of 2004, and after the police officer left, Charles tore up the papers right in front of Kathy's face, and he told her there would be no divorce. She was his wife, and she and the children were his property. He said, "I'll never sign these divorce papers." And he seemed to think as long as he didn't sign them, nothing could go forward.
It doesn't work that way.
No, and Kathy would not be swayed. She'd made up her mind.
Yeah, so when Charles was at work that day, June 1st, she and the children left the farm, taking only some personal items and some clothing. Tommy hadn't known that they were leaving. It was sprung on him because, he didn't want him to know, and he'd squeal to his father.
Yeah, he was only 11.
Yeah, so this was upsetting.
Yeah, sure it was.
And the idea that his parents were going to be separated was kind of scary for him. Now, at the same time, Kathy said, yeah, it's going to be tough, but it's going to be better in the long run, and you can see your dad anytime you want.
She was trying to be very fair with Charles. A protective order filed by Kathy against him went into effect on June 3rd because she was afraid at this point.
Well, it seems like she was thinking this through.
That's the thing, Dick, is we hear a lot of these stories, but it seems like she did everything right.
Yeah.
To try and get out of this. According to the protection order, Charles couldn't come to her new home or her place of work, and if he did try to approach her, he'd be in violation and arrested. Charles hadn't hired an attorney for the divorce, and he just chose to ignore what was going on. What he would do is he just wouldn't show up for the hearings. He didn't show up for the first scheduled hearing, and then he just ignored all the notices of court proceedings after that. I guess he just thought if he ignored it, he could put off the divorce indefinitely. But he was wrong. Eventually the judge would set a deadline, and Kathy's divorce would be granted in default. Of course, this meant that Kathy would get half of everything, including property, bank accounts, and his retirement account. And that would have really surprised Charles once he found that out.
No kidding. Kathy's lawyer had explained to her that just because it was in his name only, everything didn't belong to Charles. Turns out, which we know is true, anything that either of them had earned or acquired during their marriage belonged to the two of them and needed to be shared equally. Now, Kathy tried to explain this to Charles, but he just flat refused to believe her. He's going to find out. And she reminded him that she had worked for what they had as much as he had. But he just felt, doesn't matter.
No, he wouldn't listen to her. She was just a woman.
Now, at the same time, despite all these bad feelings between them, Kathy did want to be fair. She knew the farm was important to Charles, and also to Tommy for that matter, and she wanted to keep it intact for them. And she wanted Tommy to inherit the land one day. So she had put together some ideas on how they could share their assets without selling the farm.
Yeah, Kathy told Charles that he could just build or buy her a house, and she'd be satisfied, and he could keep the farm and everything in it. But Charles would not hear of this. He wouldn't even talk about it, and he said there will be no divorce. Although Kathy told her family and friends that she was getting a divorce, Charles didn't tell anyone that there was any problem in the marriage at all. So his family thought everything was just fine. It would actually take months before Charles' brothers learned that Kathy and the children had moved. So when his mother Helen heard about it, she was really upset. And she told both of them that they needed to fix things before people thought that they had a bad marriage.
That's another good one.
So we see where Charles got a lot of who he was.
I think so. Because we don't want people looking at us funny.
No, Charles and his family were mostly concerned with how things appeared to outsiders.
Well, sure.
This was really evident in Helen's concerns for their public image, and also the way Charles was concentrating on the appearance of the outside of the house, and really didn't care at all about how the house looked inside or how the relationships actually were. Much like Charles, his mom believed it didn't matter what was going on in the relationship, as long as you kept up appearances that you were this happy family and couple.
Yeah, we've seen that, though, more and more in families that are having relationship problems. The perception of how it looks is more important than what's actually going on.
Yes, that's a very sad thing.
Jeez, I guess. Now, Kathy got hired as a kindergarten teacher in the town of Nocona. And that's in northwest Texas, about an hour's drive from Denton. Population of Nocona, around 3,000 people, with just one elementary school there. So to Kathy, it seemed like the ideal, perfect first job. She was so excited that she began working on lesson plans right away. And once she had her classroom assigned, she decorated the classroom with all these happy, cheery items. She brought in her own rocking chair where she planned to sit and read to her class. And she purchased a rug with the alphabet on it where her students would be able to sit and learn in a nice, relaxed environment.
Gosh, I just loved kindergarten. Wasn't that like the best time of your life, kindergarten? You got the nap, you got the snack, they read you stories. Why can't life be more like that?
Well, reality sets in, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Kathy lived in the rental house in Sanger, so Tommy could be close to his dad, and this meant that she had a 55-mile drive to work. But she kind of liked the drive. It gave her a chance to be alone and think. Of course, one of the biggest issues on her mind at the time had to be how she was going to raise her children without the dark cloud of Charles keeping them down. It was exciting. She worried about Cherie's self-esteem and the way that Tommy had been learning to treat women poorly. Now that she had her own home and job, she still needed to get the divorce to go through to be really free of Charles. So she hoped that over time, maybe Charles would accept the divorce, and she could stop living in fear of him. She thought, I've moved out, maybe he'll meet someone new, and this will pass, which happens in most instances.
Usually it does.
People usually get over it.
Yeah. Now, Kathy had chosen the location of this house in Sanger because it's just 10 minutes from the farm and less than that to the kids' schools. Now, at this point, Tommy's staying at the farm with his father most of the time. He'd spend his weekends there hanging out and working on the land. When Tommy started being more cool towards his mother, Kathy soon found out that Charles had been saying terrible things about her to their son. He had actually told Tommy that the separation was entirely Kathy's fault. So, yeah, you hear about that.
Yeah, I just wonder if it just took her a little too long to leave. If she'd left when he was younger, maybe it would have gone better. Who knows? It's just really sad that he had this influence.
It's just too much speculation.
It is. But she really did want Tommy to be happy, so she allowed him to spend as much time with his father as he wanted. Unlike Tommy, though, Cherie spent most of her time with her mother. Cherie loved the modern, clean house with the furniture and decorations that she'd chosen, and after that tense atmosphere at the farmhouse, this house was really peaceful. Cherie never asked to go and stay at the farm, and at the new house she shared with her mom, she was proud to have her friends over to hang out, something she'd never done at the old house. So she really didn't miss her father at all.
Well, no, because he's constantly running her down.
Yeah, he wasn't a good dad to her.
No, so who wants to be around him?
Nobody, except maybe Tommy.
Yeah.
But he doesn't know any better.
But the same thing with Tommy. I mean, he likes being with his dad because his dad is nice to him.
Yeah, exactly.
So you see how that works.
Yes, exactly. Sure. You're right. Yeah.
So Kathy had made friends with the other kindergarten teacher at the Nocona Elementary School. I'm just thinking there's 3,000 people in this town and they need 2 kindergarten teachers?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess. Well, kindergartens are usually a small class.
So they must have had a bunch of kids all at once in that town.
I bet they did.
Anyway.
But what else is there to do out there but have babies? So it's probably a good amount of kids there to teach.
Well, apparently, because there's 2 kindergarten teachers.
Yeah.
And Kathy also reconnected with some old friends. Her graduating class at Gatesville High School had been a pretty close-knit small group, and she got invited to their 25th high school reunion. So she drove to Gatesville for the big event. Now, there's one old friend, and his name was Keith, and he had been like a big brother to Kathy. And in that summer of 2004 at the reunion, Keith was in the midst of a difficult time. His wife had been diagnosed with brain cancer. Oh, that is sucky. And she wasn't doing well. She was being treated, but she was not expected to survive for more than a year. So this is terrible.
It's incredibly sad.
Yeah. And these people have been married. They have 4 kids. And holy cow.
It's a lot to deal with, but Kathy consoled Keith. And then he listened to her talk about her issues. They started talking on the phone. They talked several times after the reunion. And Kathy confided to Keith about her unhappy marriage and her attempts to get a divorce. She also told him about the verbal and physical abuse she'd endured. So Keith was really happy for Kathy that she'd left Charles, but he also was very concerned for her safety because Charles sounded like he could be very irrational and easily angered.
Yes.
He could also kind of drink heavily sometimes and be very violent. And Kathy admitted she was afraid of Charles. She told Keith that she tried to avoid Charles when she picked up or dropped off Tommy at the farm, and Keith told her that she should never go out to that farm alone. She should always have a third party with her.
Good advice. Listen to that.
Yeah, she wouldn't follow it, though.
I know. Now, at the same reunion, she also reconnected with a high school friend named Rocky Underwood. Rocky had met Kathy in high school when he transferred in his junior year. So he was actually a year ahead of Kathy. And Rocky had had a crush on Kathy back then. He thought she was beautiful, intelligent, and funny. And in high school, she had always seemed so chipper and was very kind to her fellow students. Kathy had been shy and quiet until she was comfortable with someone. Then she was outspoken and sweet and loved to joke with people. So in Rocky's senior year, he and Kathy had dated. But then Rocky went to mortuary school so he could work at his family's funeral home business. And when he finished and graduated, Kathy still had a year left in high school. So after he graduated, Rocky left Gatesville and lost touch with Kathy. And by the time he saw her again, she was already married to Charles. So they would occasionally meet for lunch if he was in town, and sometimes she would bring her kids with her. And Rocky had met Charles a couple times, but he really didn't know anything about the relationship between Kathy and Charles.
No, but after the reunion, Rocky and Kathy exchanged emails, and she began to really open up to him about her marriage. He knew that she'd gone back to school and filed for divorce from Charles, and Rocky was single, and he did have feelings for Kathy. So that summer, she met Rocky in Haskell, which was a town about halfway between his house and hers, and they ended up spending a romantic night together in a hotel. Kathy was so excited about her new teaching career, and she emailed Rocky about her students and her big plans for the future. She seemed really happy. That November, she attended a teaching conference out in Wichita Falls, and Rocky was able to meet her there, so they had some more uninterrupted time together. Rocky would later say that he knew that he and Kathy would be married once her divorce was finalized. It was an understanding between the two of them, and he was very happy he was going to have a second chance to make a life with Kathy. He really looked at her as the one who'd gotten away.
Yeah, and Kathy was still making attempts to discuss divorce with Charles, and he continued to be in denial. Now, he still seemed to think that if he didn't cooperate, there's not going to be a divorce. He certainly didn't miss her. He certainly didn't mind to be living apart from her, but he didn't want to finalize a divorce where he would lose half his property.
Exactly.
According to friends of Kathy, she had told them about Charles being very angry to learn that Kathy was entitled to half of his 401k retirement account. Well, yeah, it's his, right?
That's what he thinks.
He believed that he had worked for it, and she didn't deserve any of it. At the same time, Kathy knew that their marital property would be divided. But because Charles would not discuss it, she put together plans that proposed 3 different ways to settle things. And she would allow Charles to choose the way he wanted to do it. But if he wasn't going to respond, she's going to go ahead and make the decision on her own.
She's more patient than I would be.
She seems to be.
Really, putting up with a lot.
Yeah, and it's all because he's just refusing to listen or believe it.
And it's because she fears him as well. She doesn't want to do anything too rash and make him angry. So I think that's part of why she was so patient. But one of the 3 choices was to sell everything and split the money, and another was for Charles to buy her a house and he could keep the farm. But then there was a third option that Kathy liked the best. She emailed this to her attorney on December 29th, 2004, and it was simple. They would split their 100 acres, and she would lease her half back to Charles. So then he would pay her half of the value of their farm equipment as well, and that would be all he'd have to do. She really knew that Tommy loved the farm, and she wanted to make sure he'd be able to keep it once he grew up. So to Kathy's way of thinking, this was the best way to do the best thing for everyone in the family.
Well, it's a pretty workable solution if there's agreement.
It's very fair. And the following day, which would be December 30th, 2004, Kathy was expected to meet with her attorney at the courthouse and finalize the divorce. Finally. Kathy and the kids had spent Christmas Day with her family in Gatesville, and while she was home, her parents and her brothers saw that she was much happier than she had been for years. She loved her job, she loved her freedom, and she had some plans for her future. The morning of December 29th, Kathy called up her mom. They discussed the divorce hearing that was scheduled for the next day. Then Kathy's friend Linda called later that morning. Kathy had seemed in good spirits and told Linda she was working on her divorce settlement. She told Linda that she was happy to be getting the divorce over with, and it really couldn't happen soon enough. She also told Linda that she had gone to the farm that morning to try one last time to convince Charles to talk about the divorce settlement. But guess what? He just flat refused to talk. Yeah, there was one kind of weird thing, though. Kathy added that when she left, Charles hugged her. She said it was like he was saying a real goodbye, and she said, "What was that all about?" because Linda knew as well as Kathy that Charles normally would show no affection to his wife. So Kathy called her brother Chris that day about 2 p.m. These two had been really close since she'd separated from Charles. Chris believed that Charles had purposely kept Kathy away from her family because he didn't want them to know about their marriage and how controlling he was. But in this call, Kathy was really excited about getting together with family members over the upcoming weekend for their grandfather's 96th birthday party. That same evening, Cherie left for a movie and dinner out with some of her friends. She would be out late, and she agreed to call Kathy later on to check in and just let her know she was okay. Then Charles dropped Tommy off at the rental house at close to 7 p.m., and as usual, he didn't get out of his car, he just dropped him off and left. So Kathy was at home working on her lesson plans.
Yeah, then later that evening, the phone rang. Kathy answered it, and it's Charles on the phone. So Kathy gathered up her divorce settlement papers, her phone, and her purse, and she's going to go out and leave for the farm, talk with Charles. So, at least in her thinking, she's getting to the end of this long journey.
Yeah, and according to Tommy, she was humming a tune as she left for the farm to speak with Charles, so she was in a good mood.
Yeah, well, she's leaving thinking that, okay, he's going to sign off on this, or hopefully he is.
Yeah, but remember, her friend Keith said, don't go there alone.
Right.
And she did that.
Well, she continued to do that, not just this final time.
True, but she should have been a little suspicious. He called her up, I would think.
He called her, well, and I'd be suspicious just with the hug that he gave her.
Right.
You know, he never does that.
Yeah.
So something's going on.
Yeah.
So the next day, Linda, Kathy's friend, called Kathy's home phone to ask her how the divorce hearing had gone. And she called twice, Cherie answering both times. She sounded nervous, but Cherie said that her mother wasn't at home. So Linda figured that Kathy was still at the courthouse. Or maybe she had stopped at the grocery store. And then as for Cherie's nervous tone, maybe she was upset about her parents' divorce being finalized.
Yeah, so she didn't think this was a terribly big deal, but she wants to find out how it went.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just that same day, so it's not too concerning.
No, it's not concerning really yet. Kathy's mom called Kathy's cell phone that day, but it went right to voicemail, and she left a message asking her to call back and fill her in on how the hearing had gone. Kim Monday, Kathy's brother Mark's wife, called Kathy's home phone too, and when Cherie answered, she told her that her mom had not come home since the night before. So Kim was like, what the fuck? She was upset. This is not something Kathy would do. She was pretty close. They were friends. And she'd never known Kathy to stay out all night without checking in with her kids. But Cherie told Kim that her mom had gone out to her dad's house the night before and hadn't come back. So at first Cherie thought, well, maybe they made up. So she drove out there when she woke up that morning and she saw Kathy's car parked out front. Her father had told her that Kathy left the night before in the car, but in the morning the car was back there. He thought that maybe she had left it there for him to change the oil or fix a leaking window, he said. So he told Cherie that her mom was probably off on a trip and, no big deal, don't worry about her.
Well, I would think that some red lights or warning signs would be going off in Cherie's head right now.
I think so. I think Cherie was in a horrible position here, and it was terribly difficult for her.
After Cherie had driven over to her dad's house, she had returned to the Sanger house, woke up her brother. Now, Tommy told his sister that Charles had brought him home from the farm about 7 o'clock the night before. Of course, this was after Cherie had gone out with her friends, so she didn't know when this all happened.
Sure.
Then a little while later, Charles had called the house and asked Kathy to come out to the farm and talk about the divorce. So according to Tommy, his mom gathered up the papers she'd been working on and told him she'd be back later. And she left humming, as we said earlier. So he thought that his dad must have said something that made her happy. So Tommy thought that maybe she had stayed at the farmhouse with his dad. So both these kids are thinking, oh, maybe things have cleared up or something.
Yeah, well, what else are they going to think, really? They're trying to think of a reasonable explanation.
Yeah, well, so that's what I'd start with. That's a reasonable explanation.
Sure.
but they're going to figure out pretty quickly that that's not the case.
No, and Cherie's older. She really couldn't believe that her mom would have done that. She knew how broken up they were, right? How they had separated, and it didn't look like this was going to happen. Didn't seem like they'd ever get back together. But she drove out to the farm a little after 7 a.m., and Kathy's Lincoln was parked in the driveway. But Cherie didn't stop there. She drove back home, and she went back to sleep. Then she woke up 2 hours later, and Kathy still wasn't home. So Cherie drove back to the farm at around 9 a.m., and this time she drove up the driveway, and she saw her dad standing in the front yard. Kathy's car was still there, but Kathy wasn't. Charles told Cherie that Kathy had only stayed there for about 10 minutes the night before. He said that he'd told her he was getting a lawyer and he planned to contest the divorce. So according to Charles, that had made Kathy angry. She'd left out the back door, telling him she was leaving. "I'm going someplace where you'll never find me, so don't look," Charles claimed that Kathy had told him. But he said that he saw her car lights driving away. He said he went to bed, and when he woke up, her car was back in the driveway. So he said he went and looked all over the place, but there was no sign of Kathy on the farm.
My bullshit meter's starting to activate.
Yes, some real red flags here.
So Charles told Cherie, go home, get her brother, and they could stay with him, at least until their mom returned. So Cherie did what he told her to do. But for the next few days, she kept calling Kathy's cell phone repeatedly, and it always went straight to voicemail. So she'd leave messages begging for her to return. And Cherie was afraid for her mother because she never replied, and her voicemail box filled up. So she's not listening to messages or anything, is she?
No.
And Cherie just couldn't believe that Kathy would leave her and Tommy without a word.
Because she wouldn't, right?
No, she wouldn't. That's just not something she'd do.
No, I mean, if she didn't care about her kids, she could have left Charles years ago.
Right.
She was all about those kids. So Kathy's sister-in-law, Kim, talked to her husband, Mark, and the rest of her in-laws about Kathy and what was going on. None of them had heard from her. So Kim was unsure of what to do. She didn't want to panic, but she was worried. Things just didn't seem right. 2 days later, on New Year's Eve, 2005, Charles and the kids went to Helen Stobaugh's house for dinner with Charles' brothers and sisters-in-law, and no one said anything about Kathy. So she hadn't visited with them on Christmas either, so I guess they didn't really expect her. But she was actually missing, and they didn't say anything to his family about it. When Charles and the kids left, one of the sisters-in-law told her husband, "Hey, Charles seems to be in a better mood than he usually is." So there's another red flag.
Yes, Charles acting happy. So classes at the Nocona Elementary School started back up on January 3rd, 2005. Kathy didn't show up, which was concerning to the other teachers, and she hadn't called. So the other kindergarten teacher, who Kathy was friends with, called Kathy's house. Cherie answered. Now, Cherie seemed to be purposely vague, only saying that her mom wasn't home right then. And she said she didn't know when her mom would be back. But then as she's talking to the kindergarten teacher, she finally told the truth, and Cherie said, "We don't know where she is." And she began to cry. "She left last week and we haven't heard from her." Now, as you can imagine, the teacher was really upset to hear that Kathy had been missing for over 5 days, because she knew Kathy well enough to know that she wouldn't do that. She wouldn't leave her kids like that. And she felt sorry for Cherie, and then told her she needed to call the police. She offered to take Cherie to the police station herself, but Cherie said, "I'll do it myself."
Yeah, so this poor girl really doesn't know what to think. Right? Her mom's gone. She doesn't want to think her father did anything to her mother. So she's really in a hard position. The teacher found the phone number for the Stobaugh farm, and she called Charles. She told him who she was and said she was calling because she was really worried about Kathy. She said, "Is there anything I could do to help?" And his answer would just hit her like a bucket of ice water. It was terrible. He said, "Well, you could bring me something to eat."
Well, that's how he flies.
Oh, I know. It's just horrible, though.
Isn't it?
So Cherie did go to the police that day. Her hands were shaking and she just couldn't stop crying. I think finally speaking to someone about it really brought reality to the forefront for her. Her mom was divorcing her dad, she told police officer Josh Vest. Her mom was 43 years old and was last seen wearing a white shirt, gray flannel pants, and a black jacket with a hood. Cherie said that her mom was a good mother and they were pretty much best friends. She had not seen or heard from her for 5 days. She had not reported her missing earlier because her dad had told her that she'd probably just gone on a little trip and she'd be back any day. So I don't think Cherie really believed that, but she wanted to believe it.
Now, Cherie said that her mom hadn't gone to work that day, which was the first day back at school. And one of the teachers had called and told Cherie to go to the police. Charles didn't know that Cherie was at the police station, and Cherie wrote out a statement for the missing person report. Then once she was done, the police officer told her to go home, go to your home in Sanger, we'll be in touch. Now, the policeman then called Kathy's brother, Chris Mundy, because he was a Fort Worth police officer. And this was the first time Chris had heard of his sister gone missing.
Yeah, Chris had known that his wife had been trying to contact Kathy, but he hadn't realized that she hadn't been seen by anyone since December 29th. He told the officer that this wasn't like Kathy at all and something definitely was wrong. Officer Vest and Denton County Sheriff's Deputy James Gibbons drove out to Charles Stobaugh's farm to talk with him, and he did seem surprised to see them, but he was very friendly and seemed pretty relaxed. But Charles made many suggestions about what may have happened to Kathy. Maybe she'd run off with a man. Maybe she was on vacation. He said once she had stayed in a motel for 2 or 3 days after they had an argument. But then he had to admit that time she had called and checked on the kids several times. So he could offer no explanation as to why she had left, and especially with her car in his driveway, in town, miles away, it's not like she could have just walked to town.
Well, that's the big thing for me in terms of his story. She left last night, and then when I woke up this morning, her car was back here. Like I was supposed to change the oil or do something to it. That's crap.
Yeah, and he said, well, maybe someone picked her up. And that didn't seem to really hold water either.
No.
Police officers actually thought Charles was way too relaxed about the situation. They knew the couple was estranged, but he had been married to Kathy for 20 years, and she was the mother of his 2 children. But then Charles suggested that Kathy was mentally unstable. So this is a real window into his thought processes.
I guess so.
I knew a woman who went back to school like Kathy did, and she ended up in the hospital with a nervous breakdown, is what he said. So this idea was so ridiculous, but it did expose Charles' opinion of women returning to college. He wasn't for it.
Apparently not. So then the officers asked if they could look in Kathy's car, and Charles agreed to this. So the Lincoln was pretty clean, and actually maybe too clean, because there were vacuum marks on the floor carpet and a pair of eyeglasses that were sitting neatly in the center console. So these guys, these 2 police officers, they're not very impressed with old Charles.
Not at all.
They think he's bullshitting them. So they're ready to leave and get a search going for Kathy, which actually should have done days earlier, but hadn't been reported. Charles wanted to offer more possibilities, and it took a few minutes for them to get out of there. They thought that Charles wanted to give them a story that would stop them from doing any more investigating. Wrong.
Well, sure he did. But they contacted the Texas Rangers about Kathy's case, and they met Officer Vest at the Sanger house where they spoke to Cherie again. Cherie told them that her mother would have never left her and her brother, and she allowed them to look around the house. Nothing was missing. Kathy's luggage, clothing, makeup, even her toothbrush were all still there. So Cherie agreed with the officers, well, no, my mom wouldn't have gone away on a trip with none of these items. Doesn't make sense. So Cherie gave the police her mom's cell number and the voicemail password. And when they listened to the voicemail messages, there were several messages from Cherie where she was actually crying and really worried. There were also some from Kathy's friends, Kathy's mother, and her sisters-in-law, but there wasn't one message from Charles. So he had lied about saying he was trying to reach her. Eventually, Charles did go to the Sanger Police Department to talk some more with the detectives. Officer Vest set up some video equipment in an interview room, before he arrived, and he watched the video on a computer at his desk while 2 Texas Rangers interviewed Charles. So they had Charles sit at one end of the small room and they sat at the other end, but despite these surroundings, which can be quite intimidating, he seemed relaxed. This interview went on for hours late into the night, with the 2 officers taking turns asking him questions. So one ranger asked Charles to begin by talking about the divorce, and Charles said that Kathy had filed at the end of May and she'd moved out on June 1st. Charles said that they had not had any arguments, and he also claimed that he hadn't planned to contest the divorce. He said, "Whatever Kathy decided, that was all right with me."
Was his nose growing as he was saying this?
You would think so. He said that he had seen her at least once a month all summer to change the oil in her car. To me, I don't know much about cars, but that seems like a lot of oil changing.
Yes, you don't need to change the oil monthly.
But while she was away for the Christmas holidays, he said, then she decided to get the divorce finalized. So Charles admitted that he knew that Kathy had been to see her divorce lawyer that Tuesday, and on Wednesday he said that he called her to see if she got everything set the way she wanted it, and she had said yes. He said that he asked if she wanted to explain it to him over the phone, but that Kathy said she would like to come out to the farm and tell him. So according to him, it's her idea to drive out to his farm that night.
Right. But what he didn't tell the detectives that when Kathy left, he had hugged her as though he would never see her again. And this was an earlier meeting which the officers didn't learn about until they talked to Kathy's friends. Charles said that he and Kathy talked at the kitchen table, and she told him that she wanted half the land, money for half the farm machinery, and most everything out of the house. And he told her, yeah, that's fine. And after Kathy told him the way she wanted to settle things, Charles had told her that he wanted to contest it. And she was unhappy with that, he said.
Yeah, so that's a little contradictory. That's very contradictory on his part, because first he was telling them he was fine with everything, and now he's admitting that he wanted to contest the divorce. He said that Kathy had said to him, well, why does the man always have to try and win? And he had answered her, I'm not trying to win, I'm just wanting to do things the fairest way, so we'll both be equal in this when we get out of it. So he said Kathy then got up and walked out the back door and said to him that he would never see her again. So according to Charles, she had turned around and said, I'm leaving, don't try to look for me, I'm going where no one can find me. Then she walked out the back door, he said. So it's interesting because of how Charles kept coming back to that back door and mentioning it. Detectives wondered if that's where she had been when he killed her.
So they've already made him suspect number 1.
Well, I think if a woman drives out to her estranged husband's house to talk about a divorce, which has been a problem, and then you never see her again, that you're going to look at him first.
You might be a little suspicious of him, right?
Yeah. But he said that night he looked out the window and saw Kathy get into her car and drive down the driveway, but he didn't see which way she turned when she came to the road. He claimed to have searched the land, the house, the barns, but not finding anything. He looked inside her car and he saw her keys on the floor, but neither her purse nor any papers were in the car, he claimed. Charles was certain that Kathy had not brought her purse into the house, he said, nor had she brought any documents with her, even though Tommy had said he saw her gather up documents right before she left her house. But Charles claimed never to have seen any documents.
And then after some more questions from the detectives, Charles said that Kathy had been wearing gray pants, a white shirt, and a black hooded jacket. Now, he was adamant that he had looked for her the next morning when he found her car in the driveway. He decided that she had left it there so he could fix a leaky window seal. At least that's his story. He did admit to learning that night that if he didn't contest the divorce, the settlement would go her way. He said he knew he would have to pay child support, but he believed Tommy would want to live with him, so he might have been able to have the divorce decree about child support for Tommy changed if he became the primary caregiver for Tommy. But Kathy was asking him to be the primary parent for both children and also asking for child support for both of them. Now, Charles said he thought Kathy might have been seeing a man because he tried to look at her phone bill, but he couldn't see without her password. Then when he was asked how many times he tried to call Kathy since she had disappeared, Charles said many times, but we know that that's a lie. because the police have already gotten into her phone records and voicemail, and there's nothing at all from Charles.
Yeah, by now the detectives had spoken to Cherie and Tommy as well, and both of them said their mother would never stay away without telling them where she was. Charles agreed, but he said he thought Kathy was just trying to give him a scare.
Okay.
She'd probably be back soon, he said. So this was a story the police would not buy into one bit. Detectives told Charles that they actually knew a lot more than Charles thought they knew, and they knew that there had been violence in that marriage. Charles denied having hit Kathy ever in their relationship. But they never argued, he said. Charles said he didn't know where she was, but the kids were worried. He said he believed that Kathy had filed for divorce because she was angry at him when he took Cherie's car away after she stayed out past curfew one night and crashed it. He'd had it repaired, he said, but then he wouldn't allow Cherie to drive it. He'd been trying to teach Cherie a lesson, he said, but Kathy had gotten really angry about that and she'd moved out. So he's trying to blame the whole divorce on this one incident.
Yes, there's some revisionist history going on here.
Absolutely.
Now then the interview was steered to the Stobaugh family dairy farm. Charles said there were 350 acres that was going to be split 3 ways among the 3 sons after their mother died. Now Kathy had never asked for any of that land, and he admitted that. But he acted as if it had never occurred to him that she would ask for it. He clearly believed she had no right to any of that land. Now detectives felt like he did not believe Kathy had a right to any of their property. So he's still persisting with that.
Yeah.
Then, before the interview ended, detectives asked to search all the land and vehicles and all the outbuildings on the property, and Charles agreed to allow it. And he agreed to take a polygraph exam, but then said, "I'll probably flunk it," because he said he thought his blood pressure would go up because he was nervous, and that would cause him to fail the test. Now, the police explained to Charles that a specialist gave the test and factored in nervousness, since, everyone's nervous about taking a polygraph.
I would imagine.
But Charles seemed pretty uncertain if he was going to go through with the test or not.
And he never would. But of course detectives had heard many red flags in that interview. The night Kathy had vanished, Charles drove Tommy home to Sangor, then went back to the farm without talking to Kathy. Now if he'd really wanted to talk, he could have done it there. There was the protection order, but he could have spoken to her outside.
Well, yeah.
And she'd gone to him before, so they had been talking occasionally. Instead, though, he'd called Kathy and asked her to come to him at the farm, so it seemed like he was setting her up, planning to kill her. Tommy had told the police that his mother was really happy when she left the house and that she had been carrying the divorce settlement papers. Charles claimed he never saw the documents, but showing them to him had been Kathy's entire reason for going to the farm.
Yeah, that's why she was going there.
Absolutely. And she'd already made the trip once that day to try and have him talk that over. Charles had never even tried to call her after her disappearance, even though he said he'd had. He'd known she wouldn't answer because he knew she was dead. That's what I think, and that's what detectives were thinking. Detectives actually felt certain that telling her he was going to sign the papers was a trick to lure her out there to the farm alone. He'd actually been off from work for 2 weeks for the holidays, so he'd had plenty of time to figure out what he was going to do to Kathy and how he was going to get rid of her body.
So police went back to the Stobaugh farm and searched the barns, the land, driving through the property on their 4-wheel vehicles. They looked in the well house, the garage, and they found nothing. There was no blood, no clothing, nothing at all to show that Kathy had even been there, except that her car was behind.
Yeah.
Now, Kathy's brother, Chris, called Helen Stobaugh, and she agreed to allow a search of her land. But that search turned up no clues to Kathy's whereabouts either. The officers had learned that Charles and his kids had eaten dinner at Helen Stabaugh's house on New Year's Eve, along with the rest of the family, his family. And Charles had seemed unusually happy, as one sister-in-law recalled. But neither Charles nor Cherie nor Tommy mentioned to his family that Kathy had been missing for 2 days. So Cherie and Tommy talked to their grandmother and their uncles and aunts and cousins, but even after Charles left them there, they didn't tell anyone that they hadn't seen their mother and didn't know where she was. Now, January 6th, Kathy's family drove up from Gatesville to see the kids because they had learned that Kathy was missing. And they took the kids out for dinner because it was Cherie's 17th birthday.
Yeah, but they knew Kathy would never willingly miss her daughter's birthday. So this was really bad. This was an ominous sign that Kathy was no longer alive. Then on January 14th, 2005, 2 weeks after Kathy was last seen, law enforcement officers came to the Stobaugh farm with a search warrant. The FBI came to help, and a canine search group went all over the house and the property. FBI agents seized bags of evidence from the house and took it for analysis. They loaded Kathy's car onto a flatbed truck, and a crime scene team went over it all in detail. But not one thing was found to help in this case. Of course, one suspicious thing was that there were absolutely no fingerprints in Kathy's car, not hers or anyone else's. So that's not normal.
No, you would say, okay, someone's wiped it down.
Exactly. So she's still missing February 9th, 2005, and detectives went to talk to a woman who had information about a computer removed from Charles' house prior to the police search. The woman said that her husband was a close friend to Charles and that he had asked her husband to go pick up Kathy's computer and keep it at their house. The officers then talked to her husband, who said he first collected Kathy's computer from Cherie and took the laptop to Charles's house, then later drove with Charles to Gainesville, where they picked up Charles's home computer, and he took it to his house to keep that for Charles as well. He shared no reason why he had the computer and claimed not to know why Charles had wanted it to be hidden from the police.
Huh. So they have Charles's computer and Kathy's laptop.
Yeah. They took both computers to the Texas Department of Public Safety forensics lab for the analysis, and the officers working in Kathy's case learned that on February 18th or 19th, Charles had asked to borrow his brother Toby's pickup truck to deliver some bales of hay. He told Toby that if anyone asked, he should say that he was delivering pipe for their mother. So why did Charles use his brother's truck when he had one of his own? According to Charles, he had told Toby that he believed his own truck was bugged, so he didn't want to use it. So that's either a lie or it's very paranoid.
It's a lie.
Okay.
There might be some paranoia in there, too. Cherie graduated from high school in May 2005, and she was the class salutatorian. That's pretty good. I mean, all this crap going on in her family, and she's second in the class.
Yeah, it's pretty good that she was able to do that.
Her father and relatives on her father's side attended the graduation. Mark and Kim Mundy drove up from Gatesville to watch her receive her graduation certificate. Mark knew that there was no way that Kathy would have missed it. No kidding.
No, she would have been in that audience cheering when Cherie gave that speech. But Kathy was missing. And if she could have been there, she would have. So this is just more evidence that Kathy was dead. Then in August 2005, about 8 months now since Kathy disappeared, officers met with a Fort Worth investigator named Brian Jameson. They opened the files and asked for his opinion. So he looked at the reports, he asked some questions, but then he told them he really couldn't think of anything else they could be doing on the case. 2 detectives met with an FBI agent who returned all the evidence the federal agency had taken for lab tests that they'd gotten from the farm, and the lab report from the FBI detailing tests about the property seized during the search of the farm and Charles's house, and also Kathy's car, and they'd found nothing to help solve this case. The test showed that spots the investigators thought may have been blood on a pair of Charles's boots were not blood. Also, remember, there were no fingerprints in the car, not a one, not even Kathy's. So that was strange, because how could Kathy have driven her car out to the farm without leaving any fingerprints on the steering wheel or the door handles? I guess she could have been wearing gloves, but it still seems odd. Also, Charles claimed to have moved it to a different spot in the driveway, but his fingerprints weren't there either. So somebody apparently had carefully wiped down every surface of that car.
Yeah, that's what I take from that.
And you just have to think, could that have been anyone but Charles? The police didn't think so. But if Charles really had nothing to do with her disappearance, then it wouldn't make sense that he would wipe down the car, would it?
Right.
So we just keep coming back to Charles killing Kathy.
What's the most likely explanation, right?
Exactly, yes.
Now, Charles had gone back to living his life as though Kathy had never existed. And part of that was that he wouldn't let Cherie or Tommy have any contact with their mother's family. So they're living with him because he's the surviving parent, and he's dictating all this stuff. Then in the spring of 2006, detectives drove to Austin to present their case to the Texas Sheriff's Association Cold Case Committee. Then after hearing everything the two officers had, the committee members gave them suggestions about investigative methods. They didn't see anything that might help solve the case, and with no new leads and with no progress in the investigation, the case was rapidly going cold.
Well, one problem before taking the case to a grand jury for an indictment against Charles was that Cherie had changed her story and now she seemed to be protecting her father. When she talked to the Sanger officer, Josh Vest, the first time, she talked about driving by the farm once and not stopping. She said she didn't want to interrupt anything private, and she said that her mother's car was parked in the driveway. But then when Cherie talked to the new investigators years later, she told them that she drove past the farm twice during the night when the car was not in the driveway, and then once when it was parked in its usual place. So if the car was gone when she drove past the first time, that would support Charles's story that Kathy drove away that night and then the car was back the next morning. But it also would have supported the police theory that he drove Kathy's body away in her own car during the night and then drove it home and cleaned it so that there were no fingerprints or any evidence at all.
Yeah, it can work both ways, right?
It could work both ways. So when Cherie told the cold case investigators the car was gone, she probably did that because she thought that it would prove her father's story. He's the only parent she has left.
Right.
Then later, maybe she realized, oh, that might do him more harm than good, and she changed her story back again. So Cherie was now saying that she never drove past the farm when the car was gone and didn't remember ever saying that she had. Cherie said that she and her dad had not been speaking for about 2 years before her mother left him, and when she had that car accident, he'd cut off her access to any family vehicles. She said that was the point when Kathy realized she needed to leave. Kathy had been waiting until the children were old enough to understand, but then once she realized that Charles was treating his daughter the same way he had been treating his wife, Kathy had decided it was time to get out of Dodge. So Cherie described that she and her mother had found the rental house in Sanger and had gone out and had fun buying all new furniture together. Kathy hadn't wanted any of the old things that Charles had never let her replace when they'd been together. Cherie described the plan that she and her mother had made for the day they knew the divorce papers would be served too. If Cherie saw her father get angry, she was supposed to grab Tommy and drive to the new house. Now, Tommy was only 12 now, and he had no idea what was going on. When Charles yelled and tore up the divorce papers, Cherie grabbed her little brother and drove to the new house. They didn't return either until Charles left for work that afternoon, and then they just ran in, gathered up their clothing and a few personal items, and they were moved out.
Now, about a month or so after Kathy had disappeared, when the family was cleaning out the house in Sanger, they found some things that they gave to investigators. Including in this were some computer printouts of Kathy's personal journal and her plans to get a divorce. Charles hadn't known what might be on Kathy's computer, and he didn't want to take any chances, so he told Cherie to get the computer, and she did. And then the prosecutors called Tommy in to talk, but he was hostile, and he wasn't going to give them any help to get his father. He said, "Why don't you go fucking prosecute a speeding ticket?" So they let him go.
So it just makes me really sad to hear what Charles did to Tommy, right? Because that was Kathy's little boy.
Yeah. So the statement that had been given by 12-year-old Tommy, while it was helpful, they didn't want to bring this 18-year-old hostile witness to the stand.
Exactly.
No way.
Well, finally, on November 12th, 2009, a grand jury put out an indictment for murder for Charles Stobaugh, and a judge signed a warrant for Charles's arrest. He'd had no idea that a grand jury was even looking at the case against him. He actually thought that Kathy's disappearance was behind him. But he didn't ask any questions of the police. He just went along. Although his bail was set at $100,000, he was out the next day. Tommy Stobaugh was strongly in defense of his dad. The prosecutor, Susan Peel, didn't want to come across as badgering Cherie, so she'd held off calling her until January 2010. Cherie didn't answer, so she left a message. "I'm not going to bother you," she said. "If you don't reply to this call, I'll take it that you're not wanting to talk to me." And sure enough, Cherie didn't call her back.
Neither kid wants to talk to the police.
No, both the kids are on their dad's side pretty heavily now.
Yeah. Now the divorce case. Remember, that's what started all this stuff, right?
Yeah, right.
That was on hold. After Charles was indicted for murder, the divorce attorney and Kathy's parents agreed to drop the divorce suit, since Charles had now been accused of murdering Kathy. It wouldn't look good to a jury if her parents still were considering her to be alive and wanting a divorce. So at this point, Tommy's 18, not a child any longer, so the issues of visitation and custody were long gone. The Mondays filed a petition to drop the lawsuit, which got done by the end of January. A divorce never was granted, so if Charles did want to remarry, it's not clear whether he's legally able to. But he seemed happy to have his money, which was the money many people believe was the reason for Kathy being missing or killed.
Sure. Well, as they prepared their case, prosecutors did speak to Rocky Underwood, the guy who dated Kathy in high school and with whom she'd been rekindling a relationship before she disappeared. Rocky was very relieved to learn that they finally planned to prosecute Charles for Kathy's murder. He'd been sure of Charles's guilt from the beginning. Back in 2004, Kathy had always answered his emails right away. They were getting kind of hot and heavy. So when she didn't reply to the messages he sent her on December 28, 2004, he'd been worried. Then, a few days later in early 2005, he'd stopped in Gatesville to visit some friends, and he'd heard that Kathy was missing. Nobody knew what had happened to her. So, of course, Rocky was stunned and heartbroken. He was afraid for her, and he wanted more information, but Kathy's brothers didn't know about his recent relationship with her, and he didn't want to be interfering. But then he received an email from Kim Monday, Mark's wife, and she wrote to him, "We hacked into Kathy's computer, and we learned that you were seeing each other. We're not mad at you. We're just glad that you were there for her." So that was reassuring for him, and from then on, Rocky was able to keep up with the investigation along with Kathy's family. Investigators had already looked into Rocky, and they'd interviewed him, and he had been eliminated as a suspect. For one thing, he had proof that he was working at his family's funeral home for 3 days surrounding her disappearance, and for another thing, he didn't have a motive. He was actually very sad.
Yeah, he's thinking of marrying her.
Yes, he was. He had nothing to gain from killing her anyway.
Yeah. Now, the first-degree murder trial of Charles Stobaugh for the murder of Kathy Stobaugh was scheduled to begin January 24th, 2011. At this point, it had been over 6 years since Kathy had driven to her estranged husband's house. She hadn't come home and she hadn't called her kids. And she hadn't taken any money from her bank account, nor had she used her cell phone, so no one thought she was still alive. But at the same time, proving she was dead and that Charles was responsible was a difficult task. There were no wounds or injuries to show, no autopsy to explain, no weapons, and there weren't any horrible dead body pictures to show to the jury. So the entire murder case was based on circumstantial evidence, mostly on the testimony of people who knew Kathy and Charles.
Yeah, so it's a difficult case.
Sure is.
The trial did finally begin. This was January 25th, 2011. The opening statements gave the lawyers a chance to lay out their cases to the jury, to tell them what to expect from witnesses, and to talk about any physical evidence. The prosecutors put up a large smiling photo of Kathy on a stand in front of the jury, and that remained there throughout the prosecution's presentation. They explained to the jury about the Stobaugh's marriage and how it had worsened over the years because Charles was emotionless and a miser who loved money more than anyone. The couple had slept in separate rooms way before Kathy moved out, and they rarely even spoke to one another. They had been married 20 years, and they were miserable. Kathy had confided to friends for years that she planned to leave Charles, but she wanted to wait until after she finished school and was able to get a good job that would support her and her kids. So she'd carried out her plan, very much in secret, and she'd filed for divorce in May of 2004. Charles called her the evening of December 29th and told her he would sign the settlement documents if she would bring them down to the farm. And then Kathy had left her rental house humming with the papers in her hand. Then the next morning, when Cherie came to the farm looking for her mother, Charles had convinced Cherie that her mother had just gone off on a trip. She would be back and there was no reason to worry. So 5 days had gone by before anyone but her husband and children even knew that she was missing. No one knew until Cherie told one of Kathy's co-workers that her mother was gone, and that co-worker had insisted that Cherie go to the police or she would. Once Charles heard that the police were involved, he had finally notified Kathy's family, but not before that.
Right.
He'd called her brother Mark, actually, and said, she runs off all the time.
Okay.
So Charles also had never helped with any of the searches. Really, his only contribution was to send one of his friends to the house in Sanger to get Kathy's computers before her family could see what was on the hard drives. So when Cherie went to the police department and reported her mother missing, Officer Vest had realized that Kathy had been outside of his jurisdiction, and he had called the sheriff's office himself and then drove to the farm and interviewed Charles. Vest had also carefully positioned Charles in front of his dashboard camera on his squad car to record everything that was said. Vest testified on the second day of the murder trial. He talked about how he was anxious to leave the farm after speaking to Charles. He wanted to talk to Kathy's family in Gatesville and notify the sheriff's investigators and the Texas Rangers about everything he knew so far. And 6 times he told Charles that he needed to leave, and 6 times Charles just seemed to ignore him and went on and on about different ideas of what might have happened to Kathy. So a 47-minute dashboard cam tape was played for the jury. Charles had claimed that he was just giving Kathy a little more time to come home. Another time he said that Kathy probably called someone to come and get her that night and left the car in the driveway. Again, he questioned her emotional state, theorizing that she might have had a nervous breakdown brought on because she went back to school. And everybody thought that sounded absolutely ludicrous.
Does. So Vest also told jurors that he had investigated numerous reports of missing people through his law enforcement career, but he'd never seen anyone react like Charles, and that made Vest immediately suspicious. Then Tiffany Hertling, Kathy's divorce attorney, testified. Now, she had gone above and beyond to help Kathy. Kathy had been determined that the divorce would go through, with or without Charles's cooperation, and she had told her attorney that she wanted to be absolutely fair to Charles in the divorce, and she wanted the farm kept for her son Tommy because he loved farming. Kathy had sent an email to her lawyer on December 29th, which was the day she drove to the farm and vanished. She had told her attorney that she would meet her the next morning at the courthouse in Denton to finalize the divorce. But Kathy did not show up for court on December 30th, 2004, and Tiffany Hertling had never heard from her client again.
Well, it's upsetting because the defense team really worked hard to trash Kathy's reputation. They focused again and again on how Kathy was dating this funeral director, and they called it Kathy having sex outside of the marriage. This didn't go over well with most people in the courtroom, though. They knew Kathy had been trying her best to be divorced, so it wasn't her fault she wasn't free. And she'd actually been very reasonable with this relationship. During her cross-examination, Kathy Stobaugh attempted to answer questions about the inconsistencies between her statements to investigators and then her testimony for the defense at trial. Prosecution believed that Cherie was changing her testimony to help out her dad. The prosecution had cell phone records admitted into evidence, and the records showed that Cherie began trying to call her mom at 9:16 p.m. on the 29th. Cherie told the court that she was with some of her high school friends that night. According to phone records, she tried again to reach her mom at 1:15 a.m., and then she made additional attempts to contact her mom at 2:25 a.m., 6:45 a.m., and 9 a.m. on December 30th. And Cherie had been concerned enough to drive to her father's house twice looking for her mom. She denied, though, that her father told her not to call the police about Kathy's disappearance. Cherie had been eventually worried enough about Kathy's whereabouts that on January 3rd, she'd driven to the elementary school where her mom was a teacher, and an employee at the school would say that Cherie burst into tears and ran out of the school when she learned that her mother hadn't shown up for her job. So Cherie admitted that she was having trouble remembering what she had said and done after her mother's disappearance. Several hours into her cross-examination, Cherie was asked about her dad's opinions and his rules generally regarding money. So Cherie agreed that her father was quite tight with money. She also said that her father was so tight-fisted he wouldn't even give the children money to buy their parents Christmas presents. She had previously told investigators that her father refused to give Kathy Mother's Day gifts because, as he said, she wasn't his mother. She also admitted that Kathy had been afraid that her husband would react with anger or violence when he was served with the divorce papers. In fact, Kathy had even hidden knives and guns that were in the house before he was served.
So in the end, the jury found Charles guilty, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Then after the jury left the courtroom, Kathy's family members were allowed to make victims' impact statements. So Kathy's brothers and her father wanted to look Charles in the eye and tell him what they thought of him. Her father went first. He said, "You have taken your children's mother away from them. You have taken my 2 sons' sister, and you have taken my daughter. You helped put my wife in the grave. I just hope that you realize how many people have suffered just because of your stupidity." Charles showed no emotion to this. Jean Monday, Kathy's mother, had died of cancer in 2008 after 4 years of grieving and searching for Kathy.
Yeah, and her husband felt like this kind of stress and tragedy certainly doesn't help someone with their health. So Charles went to prison, but then in 2014, his conviction was overturned. The appeals court said that the jury should not have convicted Charles because there was insufficient evidence to convict him beyond a reasonable doubt. The first point challenged the evidence to support his conviction, pointing out that Kathy had never been located and that no physical, forensic, or direct evidence was presented at trial linking him to the alleged offense of murder. There's no evidence, the defense argued, that a murder occurred or linking Charles to a murder, and there's no confession or directly incriminating statement by Charles himself. The circumstantial evidence presented by the state at trial was insufficient, they wrote, to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed any act directed toward Kathy on or about December 29, 2004. The U.S. Court of Criminal Appeals denied a petition by the appellate court to appeal Stobaugh's overturned murder conviction. So according to the Denton County District Attorney, the only other court that could hear the case would be the U.S. Supreme Court. And then they decided not to ask that court to consider the appeal, so he's off the hook. Stobaugh's defense attorney released a statement that read, "Mr. Stobaugh and his children are extremely pleased with the decision from the Court of Criminal Appeals. We believe the court's decision is a validation of the comprehensive and detailed decision of the unanimous panel of the Second Court of Appeals, holding that no rational juror could have found beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Stobaugh murdered his wife. Mr. Stobaugh and his children are relieved that this long journey is almost at an end and hope to move forward and continue putting their lives back together."
Wow. Chris Mundy, Kathy's younger brother, said he and his family still believe that Charles is responsible for Kathy's disappearance, and that the decision to overturn the unanimous 2011 jury decision was worrisome. He said, "It's like the appellate court is saying in the state of Texas, as long as you hide the body really well, you can get away with murder." These were 12 men and women of his peers that believed with all the evidence that he was guilty. And then you have a court of judges that didn't even hear all the evidence that say he wasn't. Monday said his family had no intentions of ever seeing Charles again, and that they would continue to work to keep Kathy's memory alive by advocating for victims of domestic abuse. Chris Mundy said, "I'm a believer in karma. We'll see what happens in the end."
So, wow, I was pretty stunned by this because I feel like a jury's decision should have more weight than that.
You would think. They basically said that these jurors were all wrong.
Yeah. And they didn't even see all the evidence the jurors did. I could see winning an appeal, but the fact that they weren't retrying him to me is upsetting.
Yeah, that upsets me too. But I guess they figured out that it wasn't going to happen.
Well, he did do a hell of a job hiding her body because nothing's been found, not a drop of blood, nothing. But he had time to plan this out, and he had a huge farm. 100 acres. There's got to be some place you could hide a body on 100 acres and it would never be found.
You would think, right?
Yeah, so I'm thinking she probably died by strangulation or something where there wasn't a lot of blood, which would make easier for him not to leave any evidence in the home or the car.
That's right.
So it's just a tragedy. And of course, as a mother, it breaks my heart that her kids, I realize that she's gone, but just the fact that her kids turned on her like that. And I'm not saying that blaming them because they were kids and that's their father. But it's just heartbreaking that she did all this. She committed herself to getting a better life for her kids, from getting away from him. And she did everything right, pretty much, right?
Right.
Except driving down there alone, I guess.
And this is what she gets for it.
And that's what she gets. Just really sucks. It's like a kick in the teeth. So yeah, it does piss me off because he's gotten away with it. So I really do like the brother's statement. As long as you hide the body well, you can get away with murder, because that's true. You don't necessarily have to have physical evidence. I think it's clear she's dead. She didn't do anything with her bank accounts or credit cards. Her Social Security hasn't brought anything up. She loved her kids, you know. She loved her job. There's no reason why she would disappear. So I at least wish they would have retried him.
Me too. That might have been able to close it a little more, one way or the other.
Yeah, it's awful. It's really a terrible, unfair result, I believe. So our sources: Associated Press and Star Telegram archives at startelegram.com, the Denton Record Chronicle archives, a book written by Donna Fielder titled The Vanished Wife. Information on Kathy's disappearance was found at thecharlieproject.org. So thank you to those sources for the information. TCB's music was written and produced by Tristan Capel. If you have comments, a case suggestion, a beer recommendation, anything really, send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. You can also go to our website, tiegrabber.com, and send us comments or write us a note there. Even better, in our show notes, I've put in a link where you can record a voicemail on your own device, and it might be played on an upcoming episode, right?
It could be.
Good
Who knows?
chance, yeah. So also, if you'd like to get your future TCB episodes commercial free and get an extra members only episode each month, and also have us send you a gift and a thank you note, you might want to consider subscribing as a Tie Grabber at tiegrabber.com. You'll get your login, you'll get a code to use your podcast app for extra episodes, and then the regular episodes you get will not have the ads. So you might enjoy that. That's something you want to do. Also, if you enjoy our show, we really appreciate it if you would leave us a review on iTunes or wherever it is that you listen.
Good idea.
Yeah, so I know we've put together some feedback today, but this is a long episode. I think we'll save it for next week.
Well, that's okay.
I think we'll wrap things up for tonight.
It'll make it easier for me next week.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time at the quiet end.
We're sitting here relaxing. Come and join us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.